Welcome. You are exactly where you need to be. Leave the outside world, all its noise, and its rush behind the door. Tonight, on NightSleepWhisper, we embark on a very special journey. An epic saga spanning 50 chapters. The legacy of the stone house. We will wander through dark forests and become the guardians of an ancient secret. Now, lean back, gently close your eyes, and focus on the rhythm of your breath. It is perfectly okay to lose yourself in the story, or even to drift into sleep. I am right here with you, among the whispers. Our journey begins. Paul drove his small blue car through the narrow streets of the village. The village was called Oakwood. It was a very old place with small shops and narrow roads. The sun was going down behind the hills. The sky was a mix of dark orange and soft grey. Paul looked out of the window. He did not see many people. He saw a man in a long brown coat walking near a shop. He saw a woman closing the curtains of her house. Everyone looked busy and quiet. Paul felt a little nervous. He was 35 years old and lived in a busy city his whole life. Now, he was moving to the countryside. He reached the end of the main road and turned onto a private path. There, on a small hill, stood the stone house. It was a very large building. The walls were made of heavy, dark grey stones. Green ivy grew up the sides of the house, covering some of the windows. Large, old trees stood around the house like tall guards. The garden was not neat. The grass was very long, and there were wild flowers everywhere. Paul parked his car and stepped out. He felt the cool evening air on his face. The house was very silent. He looked at the front door. It was made of thick, dark wood with a heavy metal handle. Paul took a deep breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a large iron key. This was his Uncle Henry's house. Uncle Henry died 2 months ago. He was a lonely man who lived alone for many years. He had no children, so he left the house to Paul. Paul walked up the stone steps. His heart was beating a little fast. He put the key into the lock. It was difficult to turn at first because the lock was old. He used both hands and turned the key. He heard a small metal click. He pushed the door, and it opened slowly. The air inside the house was very still and cool. It had a specific smell. It smelled of old paper, dust, and cold wood. The hallway was long and dark. Paul reached for the light switch on the wall. He pressed it, but nothing happened. The lights did not turn on. The electricity is probably off, Paul said to himself. His voice sounded loud in the empty hallway. He walked further into the house. He entered the living room. The furniture was all there, but it was covered with large white sheets. In the dim light, the chairs and tables looked like large, still ghosts. There were big paintings on the walls, but Paul could not see the faces of the people in the pictures. He walked to the center of the room. He looked at the fireplace. It was empty and cold. Above the fireplace, there was a large wooden clock. The clock was not moving. Paul felt a strange feeling in his stomach. He was the new owner of this house, but he felt like a guest who was not invited. He looked up at the wide wooden stairs. They led to the dark rooms on the second floor. He wondered why his uncle wanted him to have this house. He knew his life was going to be very different now. The next morning, the sun was bright and warm. Paul woke up early on a small sofa in the living room. He felt a little stiff, but the morning light made the house look less scary. He walked to the kitchen and opened the back door. The garden was full of birds and green trees. The air smelled like wet grass and flowers. Paul decided to go to his car to get his suitcase. He walked down the stone path. The grass was tall and touched his knees. Near the edge of the garden, there was a low wooden fence. On the other side of the fence was a smaller house with a very neat garden. A woman was standing there. She was tall and thin. She wore a long yellow dress and a large straw hat. She was holding a pair of garden scissors, but she was not cutting anything. She was staring at the stone house. When she saw Paul, she jumped a little. Her hands were shaking. "Good morning," Paul said with a kind smile. "I am Paul. I am Henry's nephew." The woman did not smile back. She looked at Paul's face. Then she looked at the heavy stone walls of the house. She pulled her sweater tight around her shoulders, even though the sun was warm. "Oh," she said in a small, thin voice. "You are the new owner. My name is Mrs. Miller. I live in the house next door. It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Miller." Paul said, "Did you know my uncle well?" Mrs. Miller looked around the garden quickly. She looked like she wanted to run away. "Henry was a quiet man," she said. "He stayed inside a lot, especially in the last few years. He did not want visitors." Paul noticed that she was looking at the attic window of the stone house. Her eyes were wide. "Is something wrong?" Paul asked. "This house has many stories, Paul," Mrs. Miller whispered. She moved closer to the fence. "Your uncle was looking for something. He spent many nights in that attic. I saw his flashlight moving through the windows late at night." Paul looked up at the high attic window. The glass was dusty and dark. "What was he looking for?" he asked. Mrs. Miller shook her head. Her face was very pale. "I do not know. But some things are better if they stay lost. You should be careful, young man. This village is quiet, but the stones in that house have ears." A cloud moved in front of the sun, and a shadow fell over the garden. A cold wind blew through the trees. The leaves made a dry, rubbing sound against each other. "I must go now," Mrs. Miller said suddenly. "I have much work to do in my kitchen." She turned around and walked very fast toward her house. She did not look back. Paul stood alone in his garden. He looked at the large, silent stone house. He thought about his uncle and the moving light in the attic. He felt a chill on his neck. He went to his car, grabbed his suitcase, and walked back inside. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him. Paul entered the silent house again. He thought about Mrs. Miller and her shaking hands. She was very afraid of this house. Paul looked up at the ceiling. He knew the attic was directly above him. He wanted to see what his uncle was doing there late at night. He walked up the wide wooden stairs to the second floor. At the end of the long hallway, he found a small wooden door in the ceiling. There was a long string hanging from it. Paul pulled the string, and a heavy wooden ladder moved down. It made a long, scraping sound against the floor. Paul grabbed his flashlight from his bag and started to climb. The air in the attic was very different from the rest of the house. It was hot and very dry. The smell of old dust was strong. Paul turned on his flashlight. The bright beam of light moved across the room. He saw many old things. There were broken wooden chairs, stacks of very old newspapers, and a large, empty birdcage. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. When Paul moved, the dust danced in the air like tiny insects. Paul walked slowly across the room. The old wooden floor made a loud, complaining noise under his boots. He was careful because he did not want to fall. He searched the corners of the attic. He found a box of old clothes and a bag of heavy books. Then, he saw something in the far corner, under a small, circular window. It was a large chest. It was not made of wood like the other boxes. It was made of heavy, dark iron. The metal looked very old and had some orange rust on the corners. There were beautiful patterns of leaves and flowers carved into the iron. It looked very expensive and very strong. Paul knelt down on the dusty floor. His knees made a soft sound on the wood. He put his hands on the top of the chest. The metal was very cold, even though the attic was warm. He tried to lift the lid. He pulled with all his strength. His face turned red, and his breath became fast and loud. The chest did not move. It was extremely heavy. Paul looked at the front of the chest. There was a large, old-fashioned lock. It was shaped like a circle with a small hole in the center. He tried to shake the lock, but it was solid. "What is inside here?" Paul whispered to himself. He looked around the attic for a key. He looked inside the old shoes. He looked under the stacks of newspapers. He even looked inside the empty bird cage. He found nothing. The attic was full of garbage and old memories, but the key was not there. Paul looked at the iron chest again. A small beam of sunlight came through the window and touched the metal. The chest looked like it was waiting for him. Paul felt a strange excitement in his chest. His Uncle Henry was a quiet man, but he had a big secret. Paul was sure the secret was inside this heavy iron box. He stood up and brushed the dust off his trousers. He needed to find that key. Paul climbed down from the attic. His hands were gray with dust. He went to the bathroom and washed them with cold water. The water turned dark as the dust went down the drain. He looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes looked tired. He had a big house and a heavy iron chest, but no way to open it. The key must be here, Paul said. His voice was quiet in the small bathroom. He began a careful search of the whole house. He started in the kitchen. He opened every white cabinet. He found old plates with blue flowers on them. He found heavy metal pots and many glass jars. Some jars had old spices inside. They smelled like dry leaves and pepper. He looked behind the bags of flour. He looked under the kitchen sink. He found a small box of matches and some old string, but no key. Next, Paul went into his uncle's study. This was a small, dark room on the first floor. It had a very large wooden desk in the middle. The walls were covered with tall bookshelves. Thousands of books stood there in the shadows. Paul felt a little overwhelmed. He started with the desk. He sat in the heavy leather chair. He opened the top drawer. It was full of old pens, rubber bands, and some yellow paper. He took everything out and laid it on the desk. He checked the back of the drawer to see if a key was taped there. There was nothing. He opened the bottom drawers. He found old bills and letters from many years ago. He looked at the names on the envelopes, but he did not recognize them. He stood up and looked at the bookshelves. He spent 3 hours moving the books. He pulled a book out, shook it to see if a key fell from the pages, and then put it back. He did this hundreds of times. His arms began to ache. The room felt smaller as the day went on. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows in the study grew long and thin. Paul even looked under the large green rug in the center of the room. He pushed the heavy desk with his shoulder. It was very difficult to move. There was only more dust under the desk. By late afternoon, Paul was exhausted. He sat on the floor in the middle of the messy study. He looked at the piles of paper and books around him. He felt like the house was playing a game with him. Uncle Henry was a very careful man. He would not leave a key in an easy place. Paul walked to the window. He saw Mrs. Miller in her garden again. She was watering her roses. She looked toward the stone house for a moment, then quickly looked away. Paul wondered if she knew where the key was. He shook his head. No. He wanted to find it himself. He looked at the old wooden clock on the wall. It was still silent. He realized he was very hungry, but the mystery of the chest was more important than food. The sun went down, and the stone house became very dark. Paul was very tired from searching the study all afternoon. He decided to sleep on the small sofa in the living room again. He pulled a heavy wool blanket over his legs. He watched the shadows on the ceiling for a few minutes before he closed his eyes. The house was very quiet. Only the wind moved the leaves of the large trees outside. In the middle of the night, a sudden noise woke Paul. It was a loud, heavy sound that came from the kitchen. It was like a heavy object hitting the hard floor. Paul sat up quickly. His heart was beating fast against his ribs. He stayed very still and listened. He did not hear any voices. He did not hear any footsteps. He only heard his own fast breathing. "Who is there?" Paul asked. His voice was a whisper. No one answered. He reached for his flashlight on the coffee table. He turned it on. The bright beam of light cut through the darkness of the living room. Paul stood up slowly. He felt the cold wooden floor on his feet. He walked toward the kitchen. Each step he took made a sharp, complaining noise from the old floorboards. The sound seemed very loud in the empty house. He reached the kitchen door. He stopped and listened again. Everything was silent now. He pushed the door open. The kitchen was empty. The moonlight came through the window and made the white cabinets look like silver. Paul moved his flashlight around the room. The light moved over the sink, the table, and the chairs. Suddenly, Paul saw something on the floor. It was near the back door. He walked closer. There were many small pieces of white ceramic on the dark wood. It was a broken plate. Paul recognized it. It was one of the plates with blue flowers from the cabinet. Paul felt a cold shiver on his back. He looked at the kitchen cabinet. The door of the cabinet was open. He was sure he closed all the cabinets earlier that day. He walked to the back door and checked the lock. The heavy metal bolt was still in place. The door was locked from the inside. He walked to the window. The window was also closed and locked. How did this fall? Paul wondered. He looked up at the cabinet. The plate was on a high shelf. It was not near the edge. It could not fall by itself. He looked around the kitchen again. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows of the hallway. He held his flashlight tightly. He did not see anyone. But he did not feel alone. He decided to stay in the kitchen for a while. He sat on a wooden chair and watched the door. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. He waited for the morning sun to arrive. Paul realized the stone house was more than just a building. It was full of secrets, and some of them were starting to wake up. Paul stood very still in the middle of the kitchen. The moonlight was bright and made long, thin shadows on the wooden floor. He looked down at the broken plate. The white pieces looked like sharp teeth in the dark. He did not move for a long time. He waited to hear another sound, but the house was completely silent again. He walked to the back door first. It was a heavy door with a strong iron bolt. Paul put his hand on the metal. It was very cold. He tried to pull the handle, but the door did not move. It was locked tight. He looked at the floor near the door. There were no muddy footprints. There was no water from the rain. Then, Paul went to the kitchen window. It was a small window above the sink. He looked at the glass. It was old and a bit wavy, but it was not broken. He checked the wooden latch. It was closed. He tried to push the window open, but it stayed in place. "The windows are closed," Paul said quietly. "The doors are locked. I am the only person in this house." He looked back at the kitchen cabinet. The door was still open. Paul climbed onto a wooden chair to see the high shelf. He looked at the other plates. They were all sitting in a neat row, far back from the edge of the shelf. It was impossible for a plate to fall by itself. There was no wind in the kitchen. There were no animals. Paul felt a cold shiver go down his back. He got down from the chair and took a small brush from a drawer. He began to clean up the broken ceramic pieces. He worked slowly. He did not want to cut his fingers. As he swept the floor, he looked under the kitchen table. He moved his flashlight into the dark corners. He found nothing but a bit of dust. He put the broken pieces into a small metal bin. Paul jumped at the noise. He realized he was very jumpy. Every small sound made him feel afraid. He walked to the sink and turned on the water. He washed his face with cold water. He hoped the cold would help him think clearly. Maybe the house is old. He thought. Maybe the floor moved a little bit. But Paul did not really believe that. The stone house was strong. The stones were heavy and did not move. He looked at the empty spot on the shelf where the plate used to be. It felt like a warning. Someone or something wanted him to stay awake. Paul did not go back to the living room. Instead, he stayed in the kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove. He sat at the table and watched the shadows. He held a warm cup of water in his hands. He watched the clock on the wall, but it was still not moving. He waited for the sun to rise. He knew that when the light came, he would search the house again. He needed to find an explanation for the broken plate. The morning sun finally came. It was pale and cool. Paul felt very tired because he did not sleep well, but he did not want to stay in the kitchen anymore. He went to the living room and opened the heavy curtains. The bright light hit the dusty furniture. Everything looked normal again. The white sheets on the chairs did not look like ghosts in the sunlight. Paul decided to clean the living room. He wanted to make the house feel like a home. He started with the large wooden bookshelf near the fireplace. It was full of thick books with leather covers. Most of them were about history or gardening. Paul took a small cloth and began to wipe the dust from the shelves. As he moved a very large, green book, something fell out from behind it. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper. It landed face down on the wooden floor. Paul picked it up. It was not a piece of paper. It was an old photograph. The photograph was black and white. The edges were yellow and a little bit torn. Paul held it close to his eyes. The picture showed 3 men standing in front of the stone house. The sun in the photo was bright, and the men were squinting at the camera. Paul recognized the man in the middle immediately. It was his Uncle Henry. He looked much younger in the photo. He had a short beard and a big smile. He wore a heavy wool coat and dark trousers. He looked happy and strong. But Paul did not know the other 2 men. The man on the left was very tall and thin. He had a long face and sharp eyes. He wore a dark suit and a hat. He did not smile at the camera. He looked serious and a bit angry. The man on the right was shorter and heavier. He had a round face and a small mustache. He wore a simple jacket and held a pipe in his hand. He looked like he was laughing at something. Paul turned the photograph over. There was some writing on the back in black ink. The handwriting was neat and small. It said, "The 3 Friends, October 1994. Paul looked at the house in the background of the photo. It looked exactly the same as it did today. The heavy stones, the large door, and the tall trees were all there. But the 3 men looked like they had a secret. They were standing very close together. Who are these men? Paul asked himself. And why did Henry hide this photo behind a book? He looked at the strangers again. The tall man in the suit looked a little bit familiar, but Paul could not remember where he saw that face. He put the photograph in his pocket. He felt like he was starting to see the pieces of a puzzle. He just needed to find the rest of them. The stone house was full of shadows, but this photo was a small light. Paul sat in a large wooden chair by the window. He held the old photograph in his hands. The morning light was strong now. He looked at his Uncle Henry's face again. In the photo, Henry looked full of life. He was not the lonely man Paul remembered. Paul remembered his uncle as a man who lived in shadows and wore grey clothes. But in this picture, he was wearing a bright scarf and smiling. He looked at the tall man on the left. The man had a very long nose and very thin lips. He looked like he was a businessman or a lawyer. He held a leather briefcase in one hand. Paul looked at his eyes. They were cold. Even in the old photo, the man did not look friendly. He looked like he was thinking about something very serious. Then Paul looked at the shorter man with the mustache. He was holding a pipe. He looked like he was telling a joke. He was leaning toward Henry. They looked like they were good friends. But Paul never heard his uncle mention any friends. Henry never had visitors at the stone house. He lived alone for 30 years. This photo was a piece of a life Paul did not know. Why did you keep this a secret, Uncle Henry? Paul asked the empty room. The house remained silent. Paul stood up and went back to the study. He wanted to find more information about the year 1994. He looked at the tall bookshelves again. This time, he looked for smaller things. He found a thin drawer at the bottom of a bookshelf. It was stuck. Paul pulled it very hard with both hands. Finally, the drawer opened. Inside, there was an old calendar from the year 1994. Paul opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank. But in the month of October, there were several notes. On October 12th, Henry wrote, "The meeting at the house." On October 15th, he wrote, "The chest is here. We must keep it safe." Under that sentence, there were 3 capital letters: H, M, and R. H is for Henry. Paul thought, but who are M and R? He looked at the photograph again. Maybe the tall man was M and the man with the mustache was R. He felt a little bit of fear. The iron chest in the attic was not just a random object. It was brought to the house in October 1994. It was part of a secret plan between 3 men. Paul looked out of the study window. He saw the tall trees moving in the wind. He felt like the 3 men in the photo were watching him from the past. He was now part of their story. He put the calendar and the photo on the desk. He needed to find out who M and R were. He decided to go into the village later. Maybe someone at the local shop remembered the 2 strangers from the photo. He felt that the answer to the mystery was in those 2 faces. Paul was still sitting at the desk in the study. He held the old photograph in his hand and looked at the 3 men. The room was very quiet. Suddenly, he heard a loud, firm sound. Someone was hitting the heavy iron handle against the front door. The sound moved through the silent house. Paul jumped in his chair. He was not expecting any visitors. He put the photograph into the desk drawer and walked to the hallway. He opened the large wooden door. A man was standing there on the stone steps. The man was tall and looked very professional. He wore an expensive grey suit and a perfectly clean white shirt. His black shoes were shiny and did not have any dust on them. He had a thin face and very short, grey hair. He smiled at Paul, but the smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were light blue and looked very sharp. "Good morning," the man said. His voice was smooth and very calm. "Are you Paul, the nephew of Henry?" "Yes, I am," Paul answered. He felt a bit confused. "How can I help you?" "My name is Mr. Thorne," the man said. He did not offer his hand. He kept his hands in his pockets. "I am a businessman from the city. I heard that Henry passed away. I am very sorry for your loss. I was a business partner of your uncle many years ago." Paul looked at the man's grey suit. He looked very important. "I did not know my uncle had partners," Paul said. Mr. Thorne nodded slowly. He looked past Paul into the dark hallway of the stone house. Henry was a very private man. "I am here because I want to make you an offer. I want to buy this house from you. I want to buy it today." Paul was surprised. He looked at the old, dusty walls and the wild garden. "The house is in poor condition, Mr. Thorne. It needs a lot of work. Why do you want to buy it so quickly?" Mr. Thorne smiled again. It was a cold smile. "I like the location. I have a lot of money. Paul, I can offer you $500,000. In cash. You can take the money and go back to your life in the city. You do not need this old, dusty house." Paul's heart started to beat faster. $500,000 was a huge amount of money. He could buy a new apartment and a new car. He would never have to worry about money again. But something felt wrong. Why was this man offering so much money for a broken house in a small village? "That is a lot of money," Paul said. "But I just arrived. I need some time to think about it." Mr. Thorne's face changed. For a second, he looked angry. His thin lips became even thinner. But then, he moved his face back into a calm expression. "Do not wait too long, Paul. This offer is only for a few days. The stone house is old and dangerous. It is better to sell it now." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white card. He handed it to Paul. It had his name and a phone number on it. "Call me when you are ready," he said. Mr. Thorne turned around and walked down the stone path. He climbed into a large, black car that was waiting at the end of the road. Paul watched the car drive away. He looked at the white card in his hand. Then he thought about the iron chest in the attic and the old photo in the desk. He was sure Mr. Thorne did not want the house. He wanted the secret inside it. Paul went back inside and locked the heavy door. He felt a cold wind on his neck, even though he was inside the house. Mr. Thorne was a strange man. $500,000 was a lot of money. But Paul did not trust him. He felt that the man in the grey suit knew about the iron chest in the attic. He walked into the living room. The large wooden clock above the fireplace stood tall and silent. Paul remembered that the clock was stopped at exactly 12 o'clock. He looked at the golden hands of the clock. They did not move. He looked at the dark wood of the clock's frame. It was covered in beautiful carvings of birds and leaves. Why is this clock so important? Paul asked himself. He remembered his Uncle Henry sitting in the chair near the fireplace for many hours. Henry always looked at the clock, even though it did not tell the time. Paul pulled a wooden chair close to the fireplace and stood on it. He was now high enough to touch the top of the clock. The clock was very heavy. Paul reached his hand behind the wooden box. He felt a small metal latch. He pushed the latch with his finger. A small wooden door at the back of the clock opened slowly. Paul moved his hand inside the dark space behind the clock's face. His fingers touched something small and cold. It was made of metal. He pulled it out and looked at it in the sunlight. It was a small silver key. The key was very beautiful. It had a round top with the letter H carved into the metal. The key was shiny and did not have any dust on it. It looked like someone cleaned it very often. Paul felt a jump of excitement in his chest. "H is for Henry," he whispered. He jumped down from the chair. He held the silver key tightly in his hand. He was sure this was the key to the iron chest in the attic. He looked at the clock one more time. Now that the key was gone, the clock felt like a normal piece of furniture. It was no longer a keeper of secrets. Paul ran out of the living room and went toward the stairs. He did not feel tired anymore. He forgot about the broken plate and the man in the grey suit. He only thought about the iron chest. He reached the second floor and looked up at the attic door. The wooden ladder was still down. He climbed the ladder quickly. The air in the attic was still hot and dusty. But Paul did not care. He walked across the noisy floorboards to the corner under the window. The iron chest was there, waiting in the shadows. Paul knelt down in the dust. He looked at the circular lock on the front of the chest. His hands were shaking a little bit. He put the small silver key into the lock. It fit perfectly. Paul took a deep breath. He turned the key to the right. He heard a loud, clear metal click. The lock was open. Paul put his hands on the heavy lid and prepared to see what his uncle was hiding for 30 years. Paul pulled the lid of the iron chest with both of his hands. The lid was very heavy, and the metal hinges made a long, complaining sound as they moved. Paul had to use all his strength. Finally, the chest was open. He stepped back and used his flashlight to see inside. He expected to see gold coins or expensive jewelry. But the chest was not full of treasure. Instead, it was filled with old papers, books, and leather folders. The smell of old, dry paper filled the small corner of the attic. It was a strong smell that made Paul cough. Paul sat on the floor and began to look through the items. On the top, there was a large piece of thick, yellow paper. It was folded into a small square. Paul picked it up carefully. The paper felt like it was very old and could break easily. He unfolded it on his knees. It was a map. The map was drawn by hand with black ink. It showed the village of Oakwood and the large forest behind the stone house. The drawing was very detailed. Paul saw the small squares that represented the houses in the village. He saw the wavy lines of the river. But the most important part was the forest. In the middle of the forest, someone had drawn a large red circle. Inside the circle, there were 3 letters: H, M, and R. Paul felt a shiver of excitement. These were the same initials from the old calendar. Near the red circle, the person had drawn a small picture of a stone well. The old well. Paul whispered. He remembered seeing a stone well in the woods when he was a little boy, but he did not remember exactly where it was. He looked deeper into the chest. Under the map, he found a small leather bag. It was tied with a piece of brown string. Paul untied the knot and opened the bag. Inside, there was a heavy metal compass and a small magnifying glass. Both items looked like they belonged to a professional explorer. There was also a small stack of letters. The letters were tied together with a blue ribbon. Paul took one letter out and looked at the date. It was from September 1994. The letter was addressed to his Uncle Henry. It said, "The map is finished. We are ready to go to the forest. Meet us at the stone house on Friday. Do not tell anyone. We must be very quiet. Signed, M." Paul's heart was beating fast. He was holding the evidence of a secret mission. His uncle, the tall man, and the man with the mustache were planning something in the forest 30 years ago. Why was the well so important? Why did they need a compass and a map? Paul looked at the map again. He looked at the red circle and the initials. He realized that the iron chest was a bridge to the past. The key he found in the clock was the first step, and this map was the second step. He knew what he had to do next. He had to go into the forest and find the spot on the map. He stood up and closed the iron chest. The heavy metal lid fell back into place. He took the map, the compass, and the letters with him. He climbed down the ladder, feeling like the mystery was just beginning. Paul sat at the large wooden desk in the study. He turned on a small lamp. The light was bright and yellow. He laid the old map on the flat surface of the desk. The paper was very thin and felt like dry leaves. He used the magnifying glass to look at the tiny details. The ink was faded in some places, but the lines were still clear. He saw the stone house at the bottom of the map. From the house, a dotted line moved toward the forest. The line went past a large hill and a small stream. Finally, it ended at the red circle where the well was located. Paul noticed something strange. In the corner of the map, there were small words written in pencil. They were very faint. Under the third stone. Paul read aloud. He did not know what it meant. Was there a third stone at the well? Or was it somewhere else? He looked at the letters M and R again. He thought about the man in the grey suit. Mr. Thorne. Was he M or R? No. Mr. Thorne looked too young to be the man in the photograph from 1994. Perhaps Mr. Thorne was the son of one of those men. Paul opened the leather folder from the chest. Inside, he found a small newspaper clipping. The date was October 20th, 1994. The headline said, "Local bank robbery. 3 men escape." Paul felt a shock in his chest. His breath became fast. He read the article quickly. The article said that 3 men stole a large amount of gold and cash from the village bank. They disappeared into the forest and were never found. My uncle was a bank robber. Paul whispered. He could not believe it. His Uncle Henry was always so quiet and kind. But the photo showed 3 men. The map showed a secret spot in the forest. The iron chest was full of secrets. Everything was starting to make sense. The money was never found by the police. It was still out there, hidden somewhere in the dark woods. Paul stood up and walked to the window. The forest looked like a wall of black shadows. He felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He did not want to be the nephew of a criminal, but he wanted to know the truth. He needed to find that well. If the money was there, he had to decide what to do with it. He began to prepare for his journey. He went to the kitchen and found a sturdy backpack. He put a bottle of water and some bread inside. He checked his flashlight to make sure the batteries were strong. He put the silver key, the compass, and the map into a safe pocket of his jacket. He put on his heavy leather boots and tied the laces tightly. He looked at the old clock on the wall. It was still not moving, but Paul felt that time was running out. Mr. Thorne wanted the house, and he probably knew about the map too. Paul had to reach the well before anyone else. He took a deep breath, opened the back door, and stepped out into the cool night air. The grass was wet with dew, and the forest was waiting for him. Paul stepped into the forest. The trees were very tall, and their branches reached for the sky like thin fingers. The moonlight was soft, but it did not reach the ground between the thick trees. Paul turned on his flashlight. The beam of light moved over the brown leaves and the dark trunks of the trees. He felt very small in the big, dark forest. He looked at the map again. The dotted line was easy to follow at first. He walked past a large, flat rock that looked like a table. Then he heard the sound of water. He reached the small stream from the map. The water was clear and moved quickly over the grey stones. Paul stepped over the water. The movement of the water made a soft, continuous noise against the rocks. The air here was much colder than near the house. He walked for 30 minutes. The forest became thicker. He had to use his hands to push long branches away from his face. The smell of pine trees and wet earth was very strong. Sometimes, he stopped to listen. He heard the wind moving through the high leaves. He heard the dry sound of a branch snapping somewhere behind him. Every time he heard a noise, his heart beat faster. He was alone, but he felt like the forest was watching him. "I must be close," Paul said to himself. His voice was very quiet. He checked the metal compass. The needle moved slowly and then pointed north. According to the map, the well was just behind the next hill. Paul began to climb. The ground was slippery with wet grass and old mud. He used his hands to hold onto the trunks of small trees to help him climb. He was breathing hard, and he could see his breath in the cold air. When he reached the top of the hill, he saw a small, flat clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood the old well. It was made of large, grey stones. The stones were covered in thick green moss and small plants. A heavy wooden beam sat across the top of the well. An old, rusted metal chain hung from the beam and went down into the darkness. The well looked very old and very lonely. It was exactly like the picture on the map. Paul walked slowly toward it. The grass in the clearing was long and did not have any footprints. He felt a sense of history in this place. This was the spot where the three men met 30 years ago. This was where the secret was hidden. He reached the edge of the well. He moved his flashlight over the stones. He looked down into the hole. He could not see the bottom. It was a deep, black circle. He took a small stone from the ground and dropped it into the well. He waited for several seconds. Finally, a soft splashing sound came from deep below. There was water at the bottom. Paul remembered the note on the map. Under the third stone. He began to look at the stones around the top of the well. He counted them one by one, moving his hand over the cold, wet surfaces. He felt a mix of hope and fear. Was the stolen money really here? He touched the third stone and tried to move it. Paul stood in the small clearing and looked at the old well. The air was very still, but the forest felt alive. The tall trees around him were like a circle of silent people watching him. Paul moved his flashlight over the stones again. He found the third stone from the top of the well. It was a large, flat stone with green moss on it. Unlike the other stones, this one did not look perfectly straight. It was slightly tilted to the side. Paul put his hands on the edges of the stone. It was very cold and felt a bit slimy because of the wet moss. He pushed it with his fingers. The stone did not move at first. He used more strength and pushed again. This time, he felt a small movement. The stone made a heavy, grinding sound against the other rocks. It was not held in place by cement. It was loose. Under the third stone. Paul whispered. He remembered the note from the map. He pulled the stone toward him. It was very heavy. He had to use both hands and pull hard. Slowly, the stone moved out of its place. Paul put it on the grass. Behind the stone, there was a small, dark hole in the side of the well. It was like a secret pocket. Paul put his hand into the dark hole. He felt something cold and hard. He pulled his hand out. He was holding a small metal cylinder. It was covered in rust and dirt. Paul wiped the dirt away with his sleeve. He unscrewed the top of the cylinder. Inside, there was a piece of plastic. Paul pulled the plastic out and saw a small, modern key and a piece of paper. He looked at the paper with his flashlight. It was a note. The handwriting was different from his Uncle Henry's. It was messy and fast. The note said, "The weight is too heavy for one man. We hid the first part here. The rest is in the house. Do not trust the man in the suit. Signed, R." Paul's hands began to shake. The man in the suit. He immediately thought of Mr. Thorne. Was Mr. Thorne following the same secrets 30 years later? Paul realized that the treasure was not just in one place. It was divided into parts. This well held the first clue, but the actual fortune was still missing. Suddenly, the wind changed. The trees began to move, and the leaves made a loud, rustling noise. Paul felt a sudden fear. He felt like someone was standing just outside the circle of his flashlight. He turned the light toward the trees. He saw the dark shadows of the branches, but nothing else. Then, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was the sound of heavy footsteps on the dry leaves. They were coming from the hill he just climbed. Paul turned off his flashlight immediately. The forest became pitch black. He stayed very still and held his breath. He could hear his own heart beating. The footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again. But Paul knew he was not alone. Someone else was in the woods, and they were looking for the well. He put the metal cylinder and the new key into his pocket. He decided he could not stay there. He needed to get back to the stone house before the stranger found him. He moved slowly and quietly away from the well, entering the thick shadows of the trees. Paul sat behind a large tree. His back was against the rough bark. The forest was very dark. He did not turn on his light. He heard the footsteps again. They were slow and heavy. A small light appeared on the hill. It moved left and right. It was another flashlight. Paul stayed very small and did not move. He felt the cold ground beneath his boots. The light reached the clearing. Paul watched through the branches of the bushes. A man was standing by the well. The man was tall and wore a long, dark coat. Paul could not see the man's face in the shadows, but he saw the man's hands. They were covered in leather gloves. The man moved his light over the stones. He stopped when he saw the large stone on the grass. He moved his light to the empty hole in the well. The man was very angry. He kicked a small stone into the well. A splashing sound came from deep below after a few seconds. The man looked around the clearing. His flashlight moved across the trees. For a moment, the light touched the tree where Paul was hiding. Paul closed his eyes and stayed perfectly still. His heart was so loud that he thought the man could hear it. But the light moved away. The man walked toward the other side of the hill and disappeared into the trees. Paul did not wait. He moved away in the opposite direction. He did not use his flashlight. He used his hands to feel the trees and the branches. He remembered the sound of the stream. He walked toward the noise of the moving water. The forest was full of strange noises. A large bird flew above him, and its wings made a soft, rubbing sound in the air. Paul felt the cold wind on his wet face. He was afraid, but he kept moving. He followed the stream back toward the stone house. It was very difficult to walk in the dark. He fell twice on the slippery mud. His trousers were dirty and wet, but he did not stop. He finally saw the dark shape of the house on the hill. It looked like a giant guard in the night. Paul ran across the long grass of the garden. He reached the back door and pulled his key from his pocket. He opened the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind him. He pushed the heavy iron bolt into place. Paul leaned against the door. He was breathing very fast. He was safe inside the house. He turned on his flashlight and pointed it at the floor. He wanted to see his muddy footprints. He saw his own tracks leading from the door. But then, he saw something else. Near the kitchen table, there were other footprints. These footprints were much larger than Paul's. They were made of thick, wet mud. They did not come from the back door. They started near the hallway and went toward the living room. The mud was still dark and fresh. Someone was inside the stone house while Paul was at the well. The stranger in the forest was not the only person looking for the secret. Paul realized he was not alone in his own home. Paul stood in the kitchen and stared at the large, muddy footprints. They were dark against the wood floor. He felt a cold fear in his chest. Someone was in the house while he was in the forest. He held his flashlight tightly like a weapon. He followed the tracks into the living room. The footprints stopped near the large green rug. Paul looked around the room. Everything looked the same, but the air felt different. It felt heavy. He searched the whole house. He looked behind the curtains and under the beds. He checked every closet. No one was there. The intruder was gone. Paul did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the study with the door locked. He watched the sunrise through the window. The sky turned from dark blue to a soft, pale pink. When the sun was high in the sky, Paul decided to go outside. He needed fresh air. He walked down the stone path to the end of the road. There stood the old metal mailbox. It was covered in rust. Paul opened the small door of the mailbox. Inside, there was a small package. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no name and no return address. Paul took the package back to the house. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside the brown paper, he found a small notebook. It was made of black leather. The leather felt soft and old. Paul opened the first page. There was no name, but the handwriting was very neat. It was not his uncle's writing. It was not the messy writing from the metal cylinder. The notebook was full of dates and names from 30 years ago. Paul turned the pages carefully. He saw many dates from October 1994. Next to the dates, there were lists of numbers and village names. Then, he found a page that made his heart stop. It was a list of 3 names: Henry, Robert, and Michael. Robert and Michael. Paul said, R and M. Next to the name Michael, someone had written, "The man in the suit." Paul thought about Mr. Thorne. Was Michael Thorne the man in the grey suit? Or was it his father? The notebook also mentioned Mrs. Miller. It said, "Mrs. Miller knows about the third man." Paul looked out the window at the house next door. Mrs. Miller was standing on her porch. She was watching the stone house again. She looked very small and very frightened. Paul realized that the notebook was a gift from someone who wanted to help him. Or perhaps it was a warning. The notebook also had a map of the stone house itself. On the map, there was a small X in the basement. Paul never went to the basement. The door to the basement was in the hallway, and it was always locked. Paul looked at the small silver key he found in the well. Maybe this key was not for the chest. Maybe it was for the basement. He stood up and walked toward the hallway. He wanted to find out what was under the house. Paul stood in the narrow hallway. He looked at the basement door. It was a small door made of thick, dark wood. It looked very old. The paint was peeling off in small, dry pieces. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver key he found in the metal cylinder at the well. His hand was a bit cold, but he was determined. He put the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. He turned the key slowly to the right. A loud, sharp click came from the metal lock. Paul pushed the door with his shoulder. It was very heavy, and it moved slowly. A cool, damp wind came from the darkness behind the door. Behind the door, there was a set of narrow stone stairs. They went deep into the ground. Paul turned on his flashlight. The stairs were dusty and grey. He began to walk down. He held the wooden rail, but it felt weak and shaky. The air became colder with every step he took. The basement had a strong smell of wet earth and old metal. At the bottom of the stairs, the room was surprisingly large. The floor was made of hard dirt, not wood. There were many wooden boxes and old, rusted tools against the walls. Paul moved his flashlight around the room. He saw a small wooden table in the center of the basement. On the table, there was an old radio and a heavy metal lamp. Paul walked to the table. He saw a piece of yellow paper. It was a list of names. It was not the same list from the notebook. This list had names of big banks in the city. Next to each bank name, there was a number. The numbers were very large. Paul realized this was a plan. His uncle and the other 2 men were planning their crimes here, in this cold, secret room. He looked under the table. He saw a pair of boots. They were covered in dry mud. They looked exactly like the footprints he saw in the kitchen earlier. Paul felt a cold shiver on his back. The person who was in his house was in this basement very recently. Suddenly, Paul saw something shiny near the far wall. He walked over and looked closely at the ground. It was a small gold coin. He picked it up. The coin was heavy and very bright. It was not a normal coin. It looked very old and very valuable. This is it, Paul thought. The money from the bank was real. But there was only one coin on the floor. Where was the rest of the fortune? Paul looked at the walls of the basement. The stones were large and irregular. He remembered the notebook said the basement was a secret meeting place. He began to tap on the stones with the back of his flashlight. He wanted to see if any of the stones were hollow. He heard a soft noise from upstairs. It was the sound of the front door opening. Paul's heart stopped. He turned off his flashlight immediately. He was alone in the dark basement, and someone was now inside the house above him. He stayed very still and waited in the silence. Paul stayed in the dark basement. He heard the front door close. Then, he heard heavy footsteps on the floor above him. The wood made a long, groaning sound as the person walked. Paul held his breath. He did not want to make any noise. The footsteps moved from the hallway to the living room. They were slow and careful. The person stayed in the living room for a long time. Paul heard the sound of furniture moving. It was a scraping sound on the wooden floor. Paul wondered who was up there. Was it Mr. Thorne? Or was it the man from the forest? Paul looked up at the ceiling. He could see thin lines of yellow light through the floorboards. The intruder was right above him. Paul held the gold coin so tightly that his hand began to ache. He felt like a prisoner in his own home. After 10 minutes, the footsteps moved back to the hallway. The front door opened and then closed with a loud, heavy sound. Paul waited in the basement for another 20 minutes. He wanted to be certain the house was empty and the stranger was gone. Finally, he climbed the stone stairs and entered the hallway. His legs felt a bit weak from the tension. He walked into the living room. He saw immediately that the room was different. The large green rug in the center was moved to the side. The heavy coffee table was pushed against the wall. The intruder was clearly looking for something under the rug. Paul walked to the center of the room. He looked at the floorboards. Most of them were long and narrow, but he saw a small, thin line in the wood that formed a square. He knelt down and brushed away the dust with his hand. It was a small wooden door, hidden perfectly in the floor. It did not have a lock or a metal handle. Paul used a small knife from his pocket to lift the edge of the door. The wood moved up slowly. It was heavier than it looked. Under the small door, there was a dark space. Paul used his flashlight. He saw a set of clean wooden steps. They did not go to the basement he was just in. They led to a secret room directly under the living room. Paul felt a mix of excitement and fear. This house was like a box with many secret layers. He stepped into the hole and descended the steps. The air here was dry and smelled of oil paint and old wood. At the bottom, he found himself in a small room with white stone walls. He moved his flashlight around. He saw rows of paintings leaning against the walls. They were beautiful and looked very expensive. Some showed forests, and others showed faces of people he did not know. Paul stood in the center of the room, amazed by the secret gallery. He realized that his uncle was not just a quiet man with a map. He was a man who collected beautiful things in total silence. Paul looked at the frames. They were made of heavy gold and silver. This was a fortune in art. He finally understood why Mr. Thorne wanted the house so badly. It was not for the stones or the garden. It was for this room. Paul stood in the center of the small, white room. It was very different from the rest of the stone house. The walls were not dusty, and the air did not smell like old paper. It smelled like oil and fresh wood. This room was very clean. Paul realized that his Uncle Henry spent a lot of time here. He took care of this place. Paul moved his flashlight slowly across the paintings. There were many of them. Some were large and showed dark forests under a full moon. Others were small and showed the faces of people from long ago. The colors were very bright. Paul saw deep blues, rich reds, and shiny golds. He was not an art expert, but he knew these paintings were special. They looked like they belonged in a famous museum in the city. He walked to a small wooden table in the corner of the room. On the table, there was a black book. Paul picked it up. It was a ledger. He opened it and saw rows of neat writing. The ledger listed the names of the paintings and the dates they arrived at the house. Next to each name, there was a price. Paul's eyes went wide. The prices were very, very high. Each painting was worth thousands of dollars. Uncle Henry was not just a bank robber. Paul whispered. He was a collector. He remembered the newspaper clipping about the bank robbery in 1994. The article said the men stole gold and cash. But maybe they also stole these paintings. Or perhaps they used the stolen money to buy this art. Paul felt a mix of wonder and sadness. His uncle lived a very lonely life in a dusty house, but he was surrounded by beautiful things that no one ever saw. Paul continued to look at the art. He found a portrait of 3 men sitting at a table. He recognized them immediately. It was Henry, the tall man in the suit, and the man with the mustache. In the painting, they looked like brothers. They were laughing and holding glasses of wine. Behind them, Paul saw the stone walls of the kitchen. They looked happy. It was hard to believe they were criminals. At the back of the room, there was one painting that was covered with a piece of dark silk. Paul reached out and pulled the silk away. The fabric made a soft, whispering sound as it fell to the floor. Behind it was a medium-sized painting of the stone house. It was a very detailed painting of the living room and the main hallway. The artist used a very small brush to show the wood of the floor and the stones of the walls. Paul looked at the painting for a long time. He felt like he was looking into a mirror. But then, he noticed something strange about the staircase in the picture. He moved his flashlight closer to the canvas. In the painting, under the 3rd step of the stairs, there was a tiny detail that was not in the real house. It was a small, golden box. Paul held the flashlight very close to the painting. The light was bright on the canvas. The painting showed the inside of the stone house. It was the hallway and the large wooden stairs. The artist was very talented. Every piece of wood and every stone looked real. Paul looked at the bottom of the stairs in the picture. He saw the 1st step, the 2nd step, and then the 3rd step. Under the 3rd step, there was a tiny, rectangular shape. It was painted with bright gold paint. It looked like a small box. Paul moved his magnifying glass over the detail. The gold paint was thick and shiny. In the painting, the box was hidden behind a small piece of wood that moved. It is a secret compartment. Paul whispered. His voice was full of surprise. He realized that his Uncle Henry was a very clever man. Henry did not write the location of the treasure on a piece of paper. He did not tell anyone. Instead, he painted it. He hid the secret in a beautiful piece of art. Only someone who looked very closely at the paintings could find it. Paul felt a new respect for his uncle. Henry was not just a quiet man. He was a man of many layers. Paul looked at the other paintings in the secret room. He wondered if they also had messages. He saw a painting of the old well and a painting of the village church. But his eyes always came back to the picture of the staircase. He knew he had to go back upstairs immediately. He climbed the clean wooden steps out of the secret room. He reached the living room and pulled the small floor door shut. He moved the heavy green rug back into the center of the room. He pushed the coffee table back to its original spot. He wanted the room to look exactly like it did before. He did not want the intruder to know he found the gallery. Paul walked into the hallway. The air was cool, and the house was silent. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at the 3rd step. It was made of dark, heavy oak. It looked very solid. Paul knelt on the floor. The wooden floor felt hard under his knees. He used his flashlight to see the space under the step. He remembered the painting. In the picture, the gold box was on the left side. Paul moved his hand to the left edge of the 3rd step. He felt the smooth wood. He pushed the wood with his fingers, but nothing happened. He pulled at the edge, but it did not move. Then, he felt a small, round piece of metal under the lip of the step. It was hidden in a dark shadow. Paul pressed the metal piece with his thumb. A small part of the wood moved toward him. It was a tiny drawer, perfectly hidden in the structure of the stairs. Paul reached into the drawer. His fingers touched something cold and metal. He pulled it out. It was a small box made of shiny gold. It was very heavy for its size. Paul held it in his hands. The gold was cool and smooth. He felt a great sense of excitement. He finally found what the others were looking for. He took the gold box into the living room to look at it in the light. Paul walked slowly into the kitchen. He placed the gold box on the wooden table. The box was small, about the size of a book. It was very bright. The morning sun came through the window and hit the gold. The box shone like a small star. Paul saw beautiful flowers and leaves carved into the metal. In the center of the lid, there was a small, red stone. It looked like a drop of fire. Paul sat down on a chair. He felt a lot of energy in his hands. He was very close to the truth. He looked for a lock, but there was no keyhole. He tried to lift the lid, but it was stuck. He turned the box over in his hands. He looked at the bottom. He saw a tiny message in the metal. It said, "For the third man." The third man. Paul whispered. He thought about the photograph of the three friends. Henry, Michael, and Robert. If Henry was the first man, who was the third? Was it Robert or Michael? And why did Henry leave this box for him? Paul remembered the painting in the secret room. He remembered how his uncle was a man of patterns. He looked at the red stone on the lid. He pressed the stone with his thumb. Nothing happened. Then, he tried to turn the stone. It moved a little bit to the left. He heard a soft metal sound. It was not a loud noise, but a gentle movement inside the box. He turned the stone again, this time to the right. He heard another soft movement. Finally, the lid of the box opened a few millimeters. Paul used his fingers to lift it the rest of the way. He expected to see more gold or perhaps a diamond. But the box was mostly empty. At the bottom of the box, there was a piece of white paper. It was folded very neatly. Paul took the paper out. Under the paper, there was a small, round object made of black glass. It looked like a lens for a camera. Paul put the lens on the table and opened the paper. The paper was a letter. The handwriting was definitely his Uncle Henry's. It was neat and strong. The letter was not for Paul. At the top of the page, it said, "To my friend, the third man." Paul began to read the letter. "If you are reading this, I am gone. The secret is still safe, but the others are looking for it. They do not want the paintings. They want the map of the stars. The black lens is the only way to see the path. Take it to the forest well when the moon is full. Do not let Michael find you. He is not the man we knew in 1994. He is dangerous now." Paul felt a cold shiver. Michael was one of the men in the photo. Michael was the man in the suit. Paul realized that Mr. Thorne was probably Michael's son, or perhaps Michael himself had changed his name. The letter was a warning from the past. His uncle was trying to protect a secret from his old friend. Paul looked at the black lens on the table. It was small, but it was the key to everything. Paul sat very still at the kitchen table. The gold box was open. The small black lens sat next to it. Paul held the letter in his hands. The paper felt heavy and old. His Uncle Henry wrote this letter many years ago. Paul began to read the second part of the letter. "To my friend, the third man." The letter continued. "We were like brothers. Do you remember our days in the city? We had nothing. Then, we found the map. We thought the money would make us happy. We were wrong. Michael changed. He wanted everything for himself. He forgot our friendship. He only saw the gold. Robert, I know you are hiding in the village. I know you are watching the house. I left this for you because I can no longer keep the secret." Paul stopped reading. "Robert is the third man," he whispered. The letter explained that the three friends did not just rob a bank. They found something much older. They found a secret that was hidden in the village for 100 years. Michael, the man in the suit, wanted to sell the secret to bad people. Henry and Robert did not want that. They decided to hide the treasure. They divided the clues. Henry kept the map and the paintings. Robert kept the knowledge of the stars. Paul looked at the black glass lens again. The letter said this lens was for the map of the stars. Paul did not understand what that meant. Was there a map in the sky? He looked at the window. The sun was high, but he thought about the night sky. The treasure is not just money, Robert, the letter said. It is history. It belongs to the village. If Michael gets it, he will destroy everything. Please, find my nephew Paul. He is a good man. He does not know about our past. Help him. Use the lens at the well when the moon is bright and full. The stars will show you the way. Paul felt a heavy weight in his heart. His uncle was a criminal, but he was also a man who tried to protect his home. Paul was now in the middle of a dangerous game. Michael was looking for the box. Mr. Thorne was looking for the box. And somewhere in the village, Robert was hiding. Paul folded the letter and put it back in the gold box. He put the black lens in his pocket. He felt like someone was watching him. He looked toward the window that faced Mrs. Miller's house. He remembered the notebook. It said Mrs. Miller knew about the third man. Is Robert in the village? Paul asked himself. Is he someone I know? He realized he could not stay in the house anymore. He needed to find Robert. He needed to find the third man before Michael or Mr. Thorne found him. He looked at the old clock on the wall. It was still silent. Paul took his jacket and the gold box. He walked to the front door and looked outside. The village of Oakwood looked quiet and peaceful, but Paul knew a storm was coming. He stepped out into the sun and started walking toward the center of the village. Paul walked along the narrow road that led to the center of Oakwood. The morning was bright, and the air was fresh. He passed small houses with colorful gardens. He saw a man painting a wooden fence and a woman carrying a basket of apples. Everything looked very normal and peaceful. It was hard to believe that a dark secret was hidden in this quiet village. He reached the main square. In the middle of the square, there was a small stone fountain. Around the fountain, there were a few shops, a post office, a small grocery store, and a bakery. The bakery was called the Golden Crust. A large glass window showed rows of fresh bread and sweet cakes. Paul felt a little hungry, but he was more interested in information. He pushed the door and entered the shop. The air inside was warm and smelled like sugar and flour. An older man stood behind the wooden counter. He wore a clean white apron and a small paper hat. He was busy putting some cookies into a glass jar. This was Mr. Gable, the village baker. Good morning, Mr. Gable said with a polite smile. How can I help you today? We have very fresh bread this morning. Good morning, Paul replied. I am Paul, Henry's nephew from the stone house. The baker stopped moving. He put the jar down on the counter. His smile disappeared. He looked at Paul's face for a long time. Oh, he said quietly. You are the one. I heard you moved into the old house. Paul took the old photograph from his pocket and laid it on the counter. I found this in the house, Mr. Gable. It was taken in 1994. I recognize my uncle, but I am looking for the other two men, especially the man with the mustache. His name is Robert. Mr. Gable looked at the photograph. His hands began to shake slightly. He pulled his glasses down to see the picture better. When he saw the face of the man with the mustache, his face turned very pale. He looked at the door of the bakery to see if anyone was watching. Why are you asking about these men? Mr. Gable whispered. His voice was full of fear. I found a letter. Paul said. It says Robert is the third man. I think he is still in the village. Do you know where he is? Mr. Gable pushed the photograph back toward Paul. He looked very nervous. You should not be here, Paul. That photo belongs to a time that everyone wants to forget. Robert was a good man, but he was part of something very dangerous. He changed his name many years ago. He does not want to be found. But I need to speak with him. Paul said firmly. My uncle wanted me to find him. There is a secret at the stone house, and Michael is looking for it. At the mention of the name Michael, Mr. Gable jumped. He quickly walked to the door and turned the sign to closed. He locked the door. He turned back to Paul. Listen to me, Mr. Gable said in a low, fast voice. Michael is a very bad man. He has eyes everywhere. If he sees you talking to me, we are both in trouble. You must leave the village, Paul. Go back to the city. Forget about the gold and forget about the stone house. I can't do that, Paul said. Mr. Gable sighed. He looked very tired. Then you are a brave man, or a very foolish one. Robert is still here, but he is hiding. He lives like a ghost. I cannot tell you where he is, but I can tell you this. The answer is in the history of the village church. Go there. Look at the old records. Suddenly, someone began to hit the glass door from the outside. A man in a dark jacket was standing there, looking inside. Mr. Gable looked terrified. Go out through the back door, he whispered. Now. Paul ran through the back door of the bakery. He found himself in a narrow, dark alleyway. The air here smelled like old flour and wet trash. There were many large wooden boxes stacked against the walls. Paul moved quickly and quietly. He stayed close to the shadows. He did not want the man in the dark jacket to see him. He reached the end of the alley and looked around the corner. The main street was busy now. He saw a black car driving slowly down the road. It looked like the car Mr. Thorne used. Paul felt a heavy weight of fear in his stomach. He was being hunted. He pulled his jacket tight and walked in the opposite direction of the car. He followed the baker's advice. He walked toward the village church. The church stood on a small hill at the edge of the village. It was a very old building made of the same dark grey stones as the stone house. It had a tall, thin tower that reached toward the clouds. Around the church, there was an old graveyard with many stone markers. The grass there was long and moved softly in the wind. Paul reached the heavy wooden doors of the church. He pushed them open. The doors made a long, low sound as they moved across the stone floor. Inside, the church was very large and very cold. The only light came from the tall, colored glass windows. The light on the floor was red, blue, and purple. The air smelled of old wax and cold stone. He walked down the center of the church. His boots made a sharp noise on the hard floor. He looked for a way into the basement or the records room. Near the front of the church, he saw a small wooden desk with a large, heavy book on it. This was the guest book. Paul looked at the names, but he did not see Robert or Michael. He remembered what the baker said. Robert is hiding. He lives like a ghost. Paul looked toward the side of the church. He saw a small door with a pointed arch. Above the door, there was a stone carving of an angel. Paul walked to the door and tried the handle. It was not locked. He opened it and saw a set of stone stairs leading down into the darkness. This must be the way to the records, Paul thought. He felt a cold wind coming from below. He turned on his flashlight. The beam of light showed a very dusty hallway with many shelves. The shelves were full of old books and piles of paper. Paul stepped onto the first stair. Suddenly, he heard the main church doors open again. The sound was heavy and loud. Paul did not move. He listened. He heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps on the stone floor of the church. Someone was inside the building with him. The footsteps were coming toward the front of the church. Paul quickly went down the stairs and closed the small door. He was now in the dark basement of the church, and he was not alone. Paul stayed in the church basement for a long time. He waited until he no longer heard any footsteps above him. He slowly climbed the stairs and looked into the main part of the church. It was empty. The tall windows were dark now. He ran out of the church and walked quickly back to the stone house. He did not use the main road. He walked through the fields and stayed near the trees. He reached his house, locked every door, and went to sleep on the sofa with the gold box under his pillow. The next morning, Paul woke up early. The sun was shining through the dusty windows of the living room. He felt a little better. He decided he needed to drive to the next town. He wanted to find a library with more history books, or perhaps talk to the police there. He did not trust the village of Oakwood anymore. He took his car keys and walked out the front door. The air was cool and crisp. He walked down the stone path toward his small blue car. He reached the driver's door and stopped. He looked down at the wheels. The car looked lower than usual. Paul walked around to the other side. His heart sank. All four tires were completely flat. They were resting on the grey gravel of the driveway. Paul knelt down to look at the rubber. He saw deep, clean cuts in the side of every tire. Someone did this with a sharp knife. Paul said quietly. He looked toward the road. It was empty. He looked toward Mrs. Miller's house. Her curtains were closed. The village was silent. But Paul knew someone was watching him. By cutting his tires, they were telling him something very clear. He could not leave. He was trapped in Oakwood. Paul felt a wave of anger and then a wave of fear. He was miles away from any other town. There was no bus and no train station nearby. He was alone in a large house with a secret that people were willing to kill for. He stood up and looked at the stone house. It no longer felt like a gift from his uncle. It felt like a cage made of heavy rock. He walked back into the house and sat at the kitchen table. He put his head in his hands. He thought about the man in the grey suit and the man in the forest. They were closing in on him. He looked at the gold box on the table. He remembered the black lens in his pocket. He still had the clues, but he had no way to escape. I have to keep going. He whispered to himself. I have to find Robert. He realized he could not wait for help. He had to use his feet and his mind. He looked at the map of the village again. If he could not drive, he would walk. He needed to find the third man before the person with the knife found him. He went to the closet and found a heavy stick to use for protection. He was ready to fight for the truth. Paul stood by the car for a long time. The morning was very quiet, but he felt a strange pressure in the air. He looked at the flat tires again. They looked like sad, empty bags of black rubber. The metal rims of the wheels touched the grey stones of the driveway. He felt a sudden movement in the corner of his eye. A small piece of white paper was moving under the windshield wiper. The wind was trying to blow it away, but the heavy wiper held it tight. Paul walked to the front of the car. He reached out and pulled the paper from the glass. It was a simple piece of white paper, folded once. He unfolded it with shaking fingers. The message was written in large, black capital letters. It was very short. It said, "Go back home. Go back home." Paul read quietly. A cold feeling moved through his body. He looked at the road. He looked at the tall trees near the gate. Someone was here very recently. Someone watched him sleep, cut his tires, and left this message. But there was a problem. How could he go home? His car was broken. The message was not just a suggestion. It was a threat. They wanted him to leave the mystery alone. They wanted him to stop looking for the third man and the secret of the stone house. Paul looked back at the house. The large stones looked darker in the morning light. The windows looked like empty eyes. He realized that the person who wrote the note was probably the same person who was in his kitchen. It was the same person who followed him to the well. They were playing a game with him, and the game was becoming very dangerous. He did not go back inside immediately. Instead, he walked around the car. He looked for footprints in the gravel. He found a few marks, but the stones were hard and did not show much. He felt very vulnerable standing in the open driveway. He felt like a target. "I am not leaving," Paul said to the empty air. His voice was stronger now. "My uncle wanted me to have this house. He wanted me to find the truth." He walked back to the front door and entered the house. He pushed the heavy iron bolt into place. He went to the kitchen and looked at the gold box. He could not carry it with him everywhere. It was too heavy and too bright. He needed a better hiding place. He went to the living room and looked at the large wooden clock. No, that was the first place they would look. He thought about the secret room under the rug. That was also a possibility, but the intruder already moved the rug once. Finally, he went to the kitchen. He moved a heavy bag of flour in the pantry and placed the gold box behind it. He put the black lens and the silver key in his pocket. These were small and he could keep them safe. He decided his next step. If he could not drive, he would walk to the village library. The baker told him to look at the old records. Maybe the library had more information than the church. He took his heavy walking stick and a small bottle of water. He opened the back door and looked at the forest. He decided to take the path through the trees. It was safer than the open road. He stepped out, ready to find the next piece of the puzzle. Paul walked through the forest for a long time. He stayed away from the main road. He moved quietly between the tall trees. The ground was covered in brown leaves and small branches. Every time a bird moved, Paul stopped and listened. He felt like a deer in the woods. Finally, he saw the edge of the village. He walked quickly to the library. The library was a small, square building made of red bricks. It had large windows and a heavy wooden door. It was much newer than the church or the stone house. Paul pushed the door open. Inside, the library was warm and smelled like old books and coffee. It was very quiet. There were only two people inside, an old man reading a newspaper and a woman sitting behind a large wooden desk. The woman had short grey hair and wore gold glasses. She looked up and smiled at Paul. "Good morning," she said in a quiet voice. "How can I help you today?" "Good morning," Paul said. He tried to look calm. "My name is Paul. I am living in the stone house. I want to learn about the history of the house. Do you have any books or old newspapers about it?" The woman's smile changed. She looked at him with curiosity. "The stone house. That is a very famous house in Oakwood. My name is Ms. Clark. I have been the librarian here for 20 years. She stood up and walked to a section of the library titled Village History. She pulled out a large, thin book with a blue cover. This book was written 40 years ago. She said, "It has a chapter about the stone house. Did you know it was built by a man who loved the stars?" Paul felt a spark of excitement. "An astronomer?" "Yes," Ms. Clark said. She opened the book to a page with a black and white drawing of the house. A man named Dr. Aries built it in the year 1880. He built the attic with a special window to look at the sky. People said he found something very important in the stars, but he never told anyone. He died alone in the house. Paul looked at the drawing. He thought about the black lens in his pocket. He thought about the map of the stars mentioned in his uncle's letter. The mystery was much older than the bank robbery in 1994. His uncle and his friends found Dr. Aris's secret. Is there anything about the year 1994? Paul asked. Ms. Clark shook her head. The newspapers from that year are in the basement. They are very dusty. But I remember that year. It was a dark time for Oakwood. 3 men stole from our bank. One of them lived in the stone house. After that, the village became very quiet. People stopped talking to each other. Paul thanked Ms. Clark and took the blue book to a table in the corner. He began to read. He found a map of the house from 1880. It showed the basement, the living room, and the attic. But it also showed something else. It showed a small tunnel that started under the village church and ended near the stone house. Paul's heart beat faster. The baker told him to go to the church. His uncle's letter mentioned the stars. And now, he found a tunnel. The pieces were coming together. He realized that the third man, Robert, was probably using that tunnel to move around the village without being seen. That was how the footprints appeared in his kitchen. Paul sat at the small library table for a long time. He turned the pages of the blue book very carefully. The paper felt thin, like the skin of an onion. He read more about Dr. Aries and the history of the stone house. The book said that in the year 1890, the house was not just a home. It was a meeting place for a group of people called the Society of the Silver Star. These people were scientists and thinkers. They did not want the government to know about their work. They met in the stone house because the walls were very thick. No one could hear their voices from the outside. The book described how Dr. Aries built secret spaces to hide his maps and his tools. Paul thought about the secret room under the rug. He thought about the hidden drawer in the stairs. Everything was designed to keep secrets safe. Paul found a black and white photograph of a group of men from 100 years ago. They were standing in the same hallway where Paul walked every day. They looked serious. One man held a telescope. Another man held a large, heavy book. They were looking for something in the sky, but they were also hiding from the world. The house has always been a place for secrets. Paul whispered. He realized that his Uncle Henry did not just choose the stone house by accident. Henry knew about the history of the building. He knew it was a fortress. In 1994, when Henry and his friends needed a place to hide the stolen bank money, the stone house was the perfect choice. They were following the path of Dr. Aries. Paul looked at a diagram in the book. It showed the layout of the village. He saw the stone house on the hill and the church in the center of the village. Between them, there was a faint, dotted line. The text under the drawing said, "An underground passage was built for safety during the Great Fire. The tunnel is real." Paul thought. This was the same tunnel he saw on the map earlier. It was a secret road under the ground. If the third man, Robert, was using the tunnel, he could enter the stone house at any time. This explained the muddy footprints in the kitchen. Suddenly, Paul felt a cold shiver. He looked toward the large library window. Outside, the street was quiet, but across the road, a large black car was parked. It was the same car Mr. Thorne used. The windows of the car were dark, so Paul could not see the driver. But he knew Mr. Thorne was inside. He was waiting for Paul to come out. Paul felt like a trapped animal. He could not go out the front door. He looked at the back of the library. There was a small door that led to a narrow alley. He closed the blue book and put it back on the shelf. He nodded to Ms. Clark, who was busy with some papers. He moved quickly and quietly toward the back door. He had to get to the church. He had to find the entrance to that tunnel before Mr. Thorne caught him. Paul slipped out the back door of the library. The hinges made a tiny, sharp squeak, but the alley was empty. He didn't run. Running invited attention. Instead, he walked with a fast, steady rhythm, keeping his head down. He navigated through a series of narrow lanes behind the village shops, smelling the charcoal of wood stoves and the damp scent of the afternoon shadows. He reached the church of Oakwood from the rear, entering through the graveyard. The old stone markers stood like jagged teeth in the long grass. Paul felt the weight of the black lens in his pocket. It felt warm, almost as if it were humming. He reached the side door, the one with the carving of the angel, and stepped back into the cold, silent interior of the church. The basement was just as he left it, dusty, dark, and smelling of old paper. This time, however, Paul wasn't looking for books. He was looking for a doorway. He moved his flashlight along the foundation stones of the basement wall. According to the library book, the tunnel should begin here, at the lowest point of the village. He noticed a section of the wall where the stones were slightly different. They weren't the rough, grey rocks of the rest of the basement. These were smooth, dark slabs of slate. In the center of the largest slab, there was a symbol carved deep into the stone. It was a circle with a star inside, the mark of the Society of the Silver Star. Paul pulled the black glass lens from his pocket. He held it up to his eye and looked at the carved symbol. Through the dark glass, the world changed. The basement didn't look dark anymore. It looked like it was glowing with a faint, purple light. And on the stone wall, the symbol of the star began to shine. He saw tiny lines of light that he couldn't see with his naked eye. They formed a pattern, like a map of a constellation. Paul realized the lens wasn't just for looking at the sky. It was a key for the house's many locks. He pressed the center of the star. A deep, heavy thud echoed through the room. The slate slab didn't open like a door. It sank into the floor, revealing a dark, square opening. A set of iron rungs disappeared into a tunnel that smelled of cool, moving air. This was it. The secret road to the stone house. Paul climbed down. The tunnel was narrow, with brick walls that were wet to the touch. It was tall enough for a man to walk if he bent his head. Every few meters, there was a small alcove in the wall with a rusted metal bracket, once used for torches. Paul walked for what felt like miles. He could hear the sound of his own breathing and the distant drip of water. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a small, circular room. In the center of the room sat a wooden chair and a small desk. On the desk was a half-eaten loaf of bread and a candle that was still warm. "I've been expecting you, Paul," a voice said from the shadows. Paul spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Sitting in the corner, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, was the man with the mustache from the photograph. It was Robert, the third man. But he looked much older now, and his eyes were full of a deep, ancient sadness. Paul's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept the flashlight trained on the man in the wool coat. Robert didn't flinch. He didn't look like a bank robber or a criminal. He looked like a weary scholar who had spent too many years in the dark. "You're Robert," Paul said, his voice echoing in the small stone chamber. "And you have your uncle's eyes," Robert replied. He stood up slowly, his joints popping. He walked into the light, revealing a face lined with deep wrinkles. "I saw you at the well. I saw you find the cylinder. I was worried Michael's boy, Thorne, would get to you first." "Mr. Thorne is Michael's son?" Paul asked, lowering the flashlight slightly. "Michael was always the ambitious one," Robert said, leaning against the cold brick wall. "In 1994, we didn't just rob that bank for the money, Paul. The bank had seized the estate of the last member of the Society of the Silver Star. They had the Ares ledger, the key to a discovery that makes gold look like common dust. Michael wanted to sell it to the highest bidder. Henry and we couldn't let that happen." Robert reached into a small wooden crate and pulled out a tattered piece of parchment. It was covered in complex geometric shapes and star charts. "This is the star map," Robert explained, pointing to a specific cluster of stars. Dr. Ares wasn't just looking at the sky. He found a way to use the alignment of the stars and the geology of this village to pinpoint a vein of rare earth minerals. Materials that shouldn't exist on this planet. It's a fortune, yes, but in the wrong hands, It's a weapon for industry that would destroy this valley. Paul felt the black lens in his pocket. Henry said, "I need to use the lens at the well when the moon is full." "That's tonight, isn't it?" Robert nodded. "The moon will be at its peak in 3 hours. That well isn't just a well. It's a lens itself. When the moonlight hits the water at the right angle, and you look through the black glass, the map will be projected onto the floor of the forest. It shows the exact location of the Ares vault." Suddenly, a muffled boom vibrated through the tunnel walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, coating Paul's hair. "They're in the house," Robert whispered, his eyes widening with alarm. "Thorn. He's tired of playing games. He must have found the entrance to the basement." "We have to go," Paul said, grabbing his walking stick. "The tunnel continues past this room," Robert said, gesturing to a smaller, darker opening behind the desk. "It comes out inside the old hollow oak tree near the well. If we move fast, we can reach the clearing before they realize we aren't in the house." "But Paul..." Robert gripped his arm. "If Michael catches us, he won't hesitate. He thinks the secret belongs to him by blood." Paul looked at the old man, then back at the dark tunnel. He thought of his uncle's lonely life, dedicated to protecting this secret. He wasn't just a nephew anymore. He was the guardian of Oakwood's history. "Let's go," Paul said. "I'm not letting him take it." The final stretch of the tunnel was the narrowest yet. Paul and Robert moved in a half-crouch, the damp brick walls pressing against their shoulders. The air was thin and tasted of wet limestone. Every few steps, Robert would stop, his head tilted, listening for the sound of boots in the dirt behind them. "We're close," Robert whispered, his breath hitching. "The roots are beginning to show." Paul looked up. Thick, gnarled roots of an ancient tree were snaking through the ceiling of the tunnel like petrified snakes. Robert reached for a rusted metal lever hidden behind a cluster of roots. With a heavy groan of wood and earth, a section of the wall swung outward. They stepped out into the cool night air. They were inside the trunk of a massive, dead oak tree. The center was hollow, carved out decades ago by Dr. Ares or perhaps the Society. Paul stepped through the jagged opening in the bark and into the clearing. The moon was a massive, glowing coin in the sky, perfectly round and bone-white. It sat directly above the forest, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. The well stood in the center of the clearing, its moss-covered stones looking like silver in the moonlight. "Quickly," Robert urged, stumbling toward the well. "The alignment only lasts for a few minutes." Paul ran to the edge of the well. He looked down. The water far below was perfectly still, acting like a dark mirror. The moonlight hit the water's surface, reflecting a bright, concentrated beam upward. "The lens, Paul. Hold it over the center." Paul pulled the black glass lens from his pocket. His hands were shaking, but he gripped the edges tight. He held it directly in the path of the reflected moonlight. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the black glass began to glow with an intense, violet light. The light didn't just pass through the lens, it was transformed. A complex web of light projected onto the flat, grassy ground of the clearing. It looked like a sprawling, glowing spiderweb of lines and coordinates. It was the star map, brought to life on the forest floor. In the center of the map, a single golden point of light pulsed like a heartbeat. "There," Robert pointed, his voice trembling with awe. "The entrance to the Ares vault. It's not in the house. It's under the roots of the Three Sisters, the trio of birch trees at the edge of the stream." "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice was cold and smooth. Paul spun around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Mr. Thorn. He wasn't wearing his suit anymore. He wore a tactical black jacket, and in his hand, he held a heavy, modern flashlight. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from the shadows. "The Ares vault," Thorn said, stepping into the light of the projection. His shadow cut through the glowing lines of the map. My father spent his whole life dreaming of this moment. He died in a prison cell because your uncle and this old man were too noble to share the wealth. It's not wealth, Thorn, Paul said, stepping in front of Robert. It's a responsibility. My uncle died to keep this from people like you. Thorn smiled, but it was a jagged, ugly expression. Your uncle is dead, Paul. And in 5 minutes, the moon will move, the map will vanish, and you'll be the only one who knows the coordinates. Unless, of course, you'd like to show me the way. The air in the clearing felt electric. The glowing map on the grass began to flicker as the moon moved slowly away from its peak. The violet lines grew dim, and the golden pulse at the center, the location of the vault, was fading into the natural dark of the forest. The clock is ticking, Paul, Thorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He signaled to the 2 men behind him. They moved to the sides, circling Paul and Robert like wolves. The 3 sisters. You heard the old man. Lead the way, or we can see how long Robert's heart holds up under a little interrogation. Robert looked at Paul and gave a tiny, almost invisible shake of his head. He was willing to die for the secret. But Paul looked at the fading map and then at Thorn's cold, calculating eyes. He knew he couldn't win a physical fight against 3 men. He needed to use the forest. He needed to use the secret. Fine, Paul said, his voice loud and clear. I'll show you. But let him go. He can barely walk. Thorn nodded to one of his men, who shoved Robert toward a fallen log. Stay there, old man. If you move, my friend here has a very short temper. Paul turned and began to walk toward the edge of the stream. The 3 sisters were 3 white birch trees that grew close together, their trunks twisted around each other like a braid. In the moonlight, their bark looked like pale, ghostly skin. As they reached the trees, the projected map finally vanished. The forest returned to its natural shadows. Thorn stepped forward, his heavy flashlight beam hitting the base of the birches. Where is the entrance? Thorn demanded. Paul knelt at the base of the middle tree. He remembered the diagram from the library book, the one showing the geological vein. He looked for a specific stone, a marker left by Dr. Aries. He found a small, triangular rock wedged deep between the roots. It's a pressure lock, Paul said, but it requires the lens. Thorn reached out his hand, palm up. Give it to me. Paul handed over the black glass lens. Thorn held it up to the light of his flashlight, admiring the craftsmanship. As Thorn leaned in to inspect the stone at the base of the tree, Paul noticed something. The ground near the stream wasn't just dirt, it was a thin shelf of rock covered by moss. You have to press the lens into the indentation on the rock, Paul instructed, stepping back slowly. Thorn knelt down, his focus entirely on the treasure. He pressed the lens into a small hole in the triangular stone. A deep, mechanical click echoed through the woods, a sound of ancient gears finally turning after a century of silence. But instead of a door opening, a section of the ground beneath Thorn's feet suddenly tilted. It wasn't a vault entrance. It was a secondary security measure, a pit trap designed by Dr. Aries to catch anyone who didn't know the secondary release located on the 3rd tree. Thorn let out a cry of surprise as the mossy shelf gave way. He slid into a dark, shallow trench. He wasn't seriously hurt, but the fall was enough to send his flashlight tumbling into the stream. In the sudden darkness, Paul didn't hesitate. Robert! Run! Paul yelled. He didn't run toward the house. He ran toward the stream, grabbing the heavy walking stick he had brought with him. He knew the woods better than Thorn's city guards. He had the map in his head, and he had the silver key in his pocket. He just needed to reach the true vault before Thorn climbed out of the trap. Paul didn't look back. He grabbed Robert's arm, helping the older man stand. Behind them, Thorn was cursing loudly from the trench, his voice echoing off the trees. The two guards were scrambling to pull him out, their flashlights dancing wildly like panicked fireflies. "The trap won't hold them for long," Robert wheezed, his face pale in the moonlight. "But Thorn has the lens, Paul. We can't finish this without it." "We don't need the lens anymore," Paul whispered, pulling Robert toward the edge of the rushing stream. "The lens showed us the spot. But the silver key, the one from the clock, I think it's the final piece." Paul knelt by the water. The stream was cold and fast, moving over smooth, dark rocks. He looked at the roots of the three sisters. They didn't just grow into the dirt, they snaked deep into the riverbed. He remembered the diagram from the library. The vault wasn't just a room, it was a pressurized chamber designed to be protected by the water itself. He reached into the freezing water, his fingers searching the base of a submerged stone. There, hidden behind a thick curtain of wet moss, was a small, circular hole. It was perfectly round and felt smoother than the surrounding rock. "Here," Paul said. He pulled the silver key from his pocket. The H carved into the metal caught the moonlight. He pressed the key into the hole. It slid in with a satisfying, oily smoothness. He turned it. For a moment, the only sound was the bubbling stream. Then, a heavy, grinding vibration shivered through the ground. A large section of the riverbank, a mass of stone and roots, began to slide backward. It didn't open like a door. It receded into the earth, revealing a dry, stone-lined passage that sloped downward, deep beneath the bed of the stream. "Go, Paul," Robert said, staying by the entrance. "I'll watch the path. I'm too slow for what's down there. Find the ledger. Protect it." Paul nodded, gripped his walking stick, and stepped into the passage. The air inside was strangely warm and smelled of dry ozone and ancient dust. As he walked, small crystals embedded in the walls began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light, triggered by the change in air pressure. At the end of the passage, he entered a circular chamber. This was the heart of the stone house's secret. In the center sat a pedestal made of dark basalt. On the pedestal was a thick, leather-bound book, the Ares Ledger. Surrounding it were glass jars filled with glowing, iridescent sand and strange, metallic instruments that Paul didn't recognize. He walked toward the pedestal, his heart thumping in his ears. He reached out to touch the book. "Step away from the book, Paul." Paul froze. Thorn stood at the entrance of the chamber. He was covered in mud and moss, his face scratched from the fall, but he was holding a small, black handgun. In his other hand, he held the black glass lens. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were burning with a desperate, greedy light. "It's over," Thorn said, his voice echoing in the small room. "The secret of the stars belongs to me now." Thorn stepped closer, the gun steady in his hand. The flickering light from the crystals cast long, dancing shadows against the white stone walls. He didn't look at the glowing jars or the strange instruments. His eyes were fixed entirely on the leather-bound book. "The Ares Ledger," Thorn whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and greed. "My father was obsessed with this. He said it contained the coordinates to a new heaven. He thought it was a metaphor for gold. But I know better. It's the energy source Dr. Ares discovered, the starfall mineral." Paul looked at the pedestal. Now that he was close, he saw that the basalt was carved with thousands of tiny, interlocking circles. In the center, right in front of the book, was a circular depression. It was the exact size of the black glass lens. "You can't have it, Thorn," Paul said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Look at this place. It wasn't built for profit. It was built for protection. My Uncle Henry didn't live in a dusty old house for 30 years because he was a criminal. He was a sentinel. Give me the book, Paul. Now." Thorn cocked the hammer of the gun. The metallic click sounded like a thunderclap in the small chamber. Paul slowly reached for the ledger. As his fingers touched the cold leather, he felt a strange vibration. He realized the room was humming. The sound was coming from the stream above them, the weight of the water resonating through the stone. He looked at the black lens in Thorn's hand. "The lens is a filter," Paul said suddenly. He remembered the library book and the diagram of the telescope. "The ledger is blank, isn't it? You've looked at it, and you couldn't read a word." Thorn's face twitched. "How did you know?" "Because Dr. Aries was an astronomer," Paul explained. "He knew about light refraction. The ink he used only reacts to a specific wavelength of light, the kind created when moonlight passes through that black glass lens." Thorn lunged forward, shoving the lens into Paul's hand while keeping the gun pressed against Paul's ribs. "Then show me. Read it. If I can't have the book, I'll take the words." Paul placed the black lens into the circular indentation on the pedestal. Instantly, the phosphorescent glow from the walls seemed to pull toward the center of the room. The light hit the lens, turned a deep, bruised purple, and washed over the open pages of the ledger. Suddenly, the blank parchment was filled with glowing, silver text. Calculations, star charts, and chemical formulas appeared like magic. But as Paul scanned the first page, his heart sank. The mineral Dr. Aries found wasn't just a treasure. The ledger warned that the vein was connected to the local tectonic plate. Extracting it would trigger a massive collapse, destroying the village and the valley. "It's a warning," Paul said, turning to Thorn. "If you dig this up, you'll kill everyone in Oakwood. The whole mountain will come down." Thorn laughed, a high, jagged sound. "I don't care about the village. I care about the power. Move aside, Paul." Thorn reached for the book, but as his hand crossed the beam of purple light, a sharp, electrical crackle filled the air. The basalt pedestal wasn't just a table. It was part of a large electrostatic circuit powered by the flow of the stream above. The vault was protecting itself. The blue spark from the pedestal hit Thorn with the force of a physical blow. He was thrown backward, his gun skittering across the stone floor and vanishing into a dark crevice. The black lens fell from the pedestal and rolled toward Paul. The air in the chamber grew thick with the smell of ozone, and the low hum of the stream above shifted into a violent roar. The fail-safe. Paul realized. The ledger began to glow brighter, the silver ink pulsing in time with the vibrations of the floor. Paul looked at the text. One final sentence had appeared at the bottom of the page. "To wake the star is to break the earth." The diagram on the page showed that the starfall mineral acted as a literal wedge between two massive tectonic plates. If the mineral were removed, the fault line would snap, burying Oakwood under millions of tons of mountain rock. Dr. Aries hadn't been hiding a treasure. He had been guarding a cork in a bottle. Thorn groaned, shaking his head as he tried to stand. "The book. Get the book." He wheezed, his greed still stronger than his fear. "There is no treasure. Thorn." Paul shouted over the rising noise of the water. "If we take this, the village is gone. Your father didn't understand that, and neither do you." Suddenly, the ceiling cracked. A stream of cold water burst through, splashing onto the basalt floor. The vault was designed to flood if the pedestal was tampered with improperly. It was a final act of protection, to drown the secret forever. Paul grabbed the black lens and the Aries ledger. He knew he couldn't leave the book for Thorn to find later, but he also couldn't stay. He turned toward the passage, but Thorn lunged at him, grabbing Paul's leg. "I won't go back with nothing." Thorn screamed. Paul used his walking stick to pry Thorn's hand away. "Then go back with your life." He kicked free and ran toward the sloping passage. Behind him, the chamber was filling fast. Thorn scrambled toward the pedestal, still trying to grab the jars of glowing sand, oblivious to the rocks shifting above his head. Paul reached the iron rungs of the entrance just as the water reached his waist. He climbed with every ounce of strength he had left. Above him, He saw the silver moonlight and Robert's hand reaching down. "Paul, give me your hand." Paul grabbed Robert's wrist and hauled himself out onto the muddy bank of the stream. He turned back and saw the heavy stone door of the vault grinding shut. It was a slow, inevitable movement. In the final second before the stone sealed, he saw Thorn's flashlight flicker one last time deep in the dark. Then, the vault closed. The forest went silent. The roar of the water was gone, muffled by meters of solid rock. The stream returned to its normal path, bubbling peacefully over the mossy stones as if nothing had happened. Robert looked at the wet, leather-bound book in Paul's arms. "You saved it." "No," Paul said, looking at the dark house on the hill. "I think the house saved us." The sun rose over the village of Oakwood, painting the grey stones of the house in shades of gold and amber. Paul sat on the front steps, his boots caked in dried mud and his jacket torn. The forest was peaceful now. The birds sang their morning songs, and the stream continued its eternal journey toward the valley, its secret safe beneath the earth. Robert stood beside him, leaning on a wooden cane. He looked older than he had the day before, but the weight of 30 years of hiding seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. "The police found the car," Robert said quietly. "Abandoned near the edge of the woods. Thorn's men are gone. They won't come back. Without the lens or the map, they have nothing but a story that no one will believe." Paul looked at the leather-bound ledger in his lap. It was dry now, the silver ink invisible once more without the purple light of the black lens. "What do I do with it, Robert?" "It's too dangerous to keep, and too important to destroy." "You do what your uncle did," Robert replied, looking toward the horizon. "You become the next Sentinel. You live in this house, you watch the woods, and you ensure that the cork stays in the bottle. Henry wasn't a prisoner here, Paul. He was a guardian." Later that morning, Mrs. Miller walked across the grass. She wasn't carrying a basket of laundry this time. She held a small, silver tray with 2 cups of hot tea. She sat down next to Paul and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I saw the light at the well last night," she said softly. "I knew the time had come. Your uncle told me that one day, a young man would arrive who was brave enough to see the truth. He was right about you." Paul realized then that the whole village hadn't been watching him with suspicion. They had been watching him with hope. The stone house wasn't a mystery to them. It was their protector, the legacy of the stone house. As the weeks passed, Paul repaired his car and cleaned the house. He didn't sell the paintings in the secret gallery. Instead, he donated them anonymously to the city museum, using the reward money to fix the village library and the church roof. He kept only the ledger, hidden behind the 3rd step of the stairs, and the black lens, which he wore on a chain around his neck. The stone house was no longer a place of shadows. Paul opened the curtains, planted new flowers in the garden, and invited the neighbors for tea. But every night, before he went to sleep, he would go to the attic and look through the special window at the stars. The final secrets of the stone house were settled. The treasure, not gold, but a delicate balance of nature and history. The third man. Robert remained in the village, finally living under his real name. The Sentinel. Paul accepted his role, knowing that some secrets are worth a lifetime of silence. Paul looked at the old photograph of the 3 friends one last time before placing it in a frame on the mantel. Henry, Robert, and even Michael, before the greed took him, looked back at him, young and full of life. The story of 1994 was over. A new story was beginning. The weeks following the confrontation at the Three Sisters were deceptively quiet. Paul spent his days cataloguing the remnants of his uncle's life, but his mind always drifted back to the Aries ledger. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning the heavy oak shelves in the study, Paul noticed a peculiar alignment. When the sun, rarely visible through the clouds, hit the brass fixtures of the room, They pointed toward a section of the wall that felt unnaturally cold. Using the silver key, Paul experimented with various decorative carvings until a section of the bookshelf slid back with a hiss of ancient hydraulics. Behind it lay Dr. Aris's private workshop. Unlike the secret gallery, this room was a chaotic temple of 19th-century science. Glass tubes, copper coils, and brass orreries filled the space. In the center of the room sat a large, specialized desk. Upon it lay a map not of the village, but of the entire mountain range. Paul noticed that the vein of starfall mineral was part of a larger network. It wasn't just a cork in a bottle. It was a conductor. Dr. Aris had written in the margins. The resonance is increasing. The stones are singing to the sky. Paul sat in the high-backed leather chair, feeling the weight of the history around him. He found a set of blueprints for the stone house itself. The house wasn't just built over the secret. It was a part of it. The thick stone walls were laced with thin copper wires, turning the entire structure into a giant antenna. He realized that the Society of the Silver Star wasn't just a group of scholars. They were listeners. They were waiting for a signal that hadn't arrived for 100 years. As Paul touched a small, crystalline dial on the desk, a low hum vibrated through his fingertips. The black lens around his neck began to glow a soft, rhythmic violet. "What were you waiting for, Doctor?" Paul whispered. He looked at a calendar on the wall, hand-drawn by Aris. It ended on a specific date in the year 2026. A date that was only months away. The hum didn't stop. Over the next few days, the vibration moved from the workshop into the very bones of the stone house. Paul found it difficult to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw patterns of light, constellations that shifted and blurred into mathematical equations. He sought out Robert, who was now staying in a small cottage near the village center. Robert looked at Paul's tired eyes and sighed. "The resonance," he said, pouring 2 cups of tea. Henry used to complain about it. He said the house felt restless every few decades. We thought it was just the earth shifting, but the ledger says otherwise. Robert explained that the starfall mineral had a specific resonant frequency, according to Dr. Aris's notes. This frequency was determined by the formula, was the capacitance of the atmospheric charge. As the stars align, Robert said, the atmospheric charge increases. The mountain begins to act like a giant tuning fork. If the resonance becomes too high, the energy has to go somewhere. Paul realized the danger. If the energy builds up and can't be released, that's what triggers the seismic collapse. The vault wasn't just hiding the mineral. It was supposed to be a grounding rod. They returned to the stone house and descended into the workshop. Paul showed Robert the copper-laced blueprints. "The house is the release valve," Paul said. "But the system is broken. Look at these wires." He pointed to the schematics of the attic. A century of weathering and his uncle's lack of technical knowledge had allowed the antenna in the roof to disconnect. "If we don't fix the connection before the peak of the celestial alignment," Paul warned, "the energy will stay trapped in the fault line. Oakwood won't just collapse. It will be the epicenter of a massive discharge." Just as Paul and Robert began planning the repairs to the attic antenna, a new complication arrived in Oakwood. 3 large white SUVs, clean and modern, parked in the village square. A team of men and women in high-tech outdoor gear began setting up tripods and laser sensors near the forest edge. They called themselves GeoCore Solutions. Their lead scientist, a woman named Dr. Aris, disturbingly sharing the name of the original architect, approached the stone house. She was polite, professional, and had a smile that felt like a sharp blade. "Mr. Paul," she said, holding out a business card. "We're here on a government contract to study the recent seismic tremors in the valley. We've noticed some unusual electromagnetic readings coming from your property." Paul felt a chill. He remembered his uncle's warning about Michael's benefactors. Thorn had been a lone wolf, but these people had the backing of a corporation. They didn't want a quick score, they wanted the source. I haven't noticed anything unusual, Paul lied, leaning against his walking stick. Just an old house settling. Dr. Aries tilted her head, her eyes scanning the stone walls. This house is built with a very high concentration of magnetite and copper. Mr. Paul. In fact, according to our satellite imagery, your home is the brightest thermal anomaly in the state. We'd like to install some sensors in your attic. I'm afraid the attic is unstable, Paul said firmly. Liability issues. You understand. She didn't push further, but as she walked away, Paul saw her signal to one of her team members. They weren't going to wait for permission. Paul realized he was now in a race against two enemies: the rising energy of the mountain and a corporate team that wanted to harvest it. He needed to get into the attic and reconnect the antenna before GeoCore found a way into the vault. Paul knew he couldn't fight GeoCore alone. That evening, he visited Mrs. Miller. She was sitting in her usual spot on the porch, but she wasn't knitting. She was holding a small, silver key that looked remarkably similar to Paul's. "They're coming for the heart of the mountain, aren't they?" she asked before Paul could speak. "You know who they are. GeoCore is just a name," she said, her voice hard. "They are the descendants of the men who tried to shut down Dr. Aries 100 years ago. My family has been the archivists for the society since the beginning. We don't guard the house, we guard the people." She led Paul into her small living room and pulled a hidden lever behind a framed photograph of the village in 1920. A small safe opened, containing a stack of leather-bound journals. "These are the logs of the other Sentinels." There were others, Paul. Not just in this village, but all over the world. The Silver Star was a network. The journals revealed that the starfall mineral was part of a global grid. Oakwood was a node, a relay station. If the node in Oakwood failed or was harvested greedily, it would create a chain reaction across the entire network. "The woman, the scientist," Paul said. "She has the same name as the doctor. She is his great-granddaughter," Mrs. Miller revealed. "But she doesn't want to protect his legacy. She thinks she can tame the resonance to create a limitless power source. She doesn't understand that the mineral isn't a battery. It's a living part of the Earth's crust." Mrs. Miller handed Paul a small, glass vial filled with a silver liquid. "This is the mercury of the stars. Dr. Aries used it to coat the antenna contacts. Without it, the copper will melt under the discharge. You have to get to the roof tonight. I will keep the surveyors distracted." Paul looked at the vial. The liquid moved with a life of its own, swirling in patterns that matched the violet glow of his lens. The stakes had just become global. The moon was hidden behind a thick veil of iron-grey clouds as Paul stepped onto the narrow stone ledge outside the third-floor window. The wind whipped around the corners of the stone house, smelling of rain and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. Below, in the village square, the white SUVs of GeoCore Solutions sat like silent predators, their high-tech sensors glowing with rhythmic green pulses. Paul knew he couldn't use the stairs. Dr. Ariz's team had already placed acoustic monitors near the main hallway. He gripped the rough granite of the house's exterior. The stones felt warm, unnaturally warm, vibrating with the rising resonance of the mountain. In his pocket, the vial of mercury of the stars felt like a heavy, shifting weight. He needed to reach the copper spire atop the attic, the highest point of the antenna Dr. Aries had designed over a century ago. Every muscle in Paul's arms ached. He reached for a gargoyle carved in the shape of a celestial bird, using its wings to haul himself upward. As he climbed, he looked toward the forest. The three sisters were glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. The earth was preparing for the discharge, and the stone house was the only thing standing between Oakwood and a tectonic disaster. He reached the roofline. The slates were slick with mist, making every step a gamble. He crawled toward the central spire, a masterpiece of Victorian engineering made of twisted copper and silver filigree. He could see where the connection had failed. A thick grounding cable had snapped during a storm years ago, its ends frayed and blackened by oxidation. Just a few more feet. He whispered to himself. Suddenly, a bright spotlight cut through the darkness from the tree line. Geocore had seen him. A megaphone crackled to life. "Mr. Paul, step away from the spire. You are interfering with a federal geological survey." Paul ignored them. He reached for the frayed cable, the silver vial ready in his hand. He had minutes before they reached the front door. While the guards scrambled toward the house, Paul realized the spire was only half of the mechanism. To properly ground the energy, the attic's eye, a massive, specialized telescope, had to be aligned with the North Star. He slipped through a small skylight and dropped into the attic. The room was a cathedral of wood and glass. In the center stood a telescope the size of a small car, its brass body polished to a mirror finish. Unlike a normal telescope, its lenses were not made of glass, but of thinly sliced quartz infused with gold dust. Paul checked the ledger in his mind. He needed to calculate the zenith angle for the current alignment. Using the brass dials, he began to rotate the massive instrument. The gears groaned, protesting a century of stillness. Below, he heard the heavy thud of the front door being breached. "Paul, we know you're up there." Dr. Ariz's voice echoed through the floorboards. Paul ignored the panic. He looked through the eyepiece. The sky was a swirl of violet and black. As he adjusted the fine focus, the black lens around his neck began to vibrate in sympathy with the telescope. The mercury of the stars in his pocket began to glow, casting long, liquid shadows against the rafters. He realized the telescope didn't just see the stars. It focused their energy. He found the coordinates. The North Star sat perfectly in the center of the quartz lens. A low, harmonic hum filled the room, so deep it vibrated in Paul's teeth. The house was finally looking at the sky, but the antenna on the roof was still broken. He had to go back out, apply the mercury, and fuse the connection while the energy was peaking. The wind had reached a fever pitch by the time Paul climbed back onto the spire. The air was so saturated with static that his hair stood on end, and small blue sparks, St. Elmo's fire, danced along the copper filigree. He could see the Geocore team below, setting up a perimeter. They were afraid to enter the house now. The electromagnetic field was so strong it was frying their electronic equipment. Paul uncorked the vial of mercury of the stars. The liquid didn't pour. It flowed upward, attracted to the copper spire. He carefully coated the frayed ends of the grounding cable. The silver liquid acted as a superconductor, its resistance approaching zero. As the mercury touched the metal, the frayed wires knit themselves back together, fused by a strange, alchemical heat. The moment the connection was restored, a bolt of violet light shot down from the sky, striking the spire. Paul was thrown back against the slates, his vision white. He wasn't hurt, but he felt changed. The energy wasn't just passing through the house. It was passing through him. He could feel the heartbeat of the mountain, the slow, grinding pressure of the tectonic plates, and the vast, cold emptiness of space. The resonance was no longer a threat. It was a conversation. The stone house was now a bridge. He looked down at the village. The streetlights had all blown out, but the ground itself was glowing with a soft, pulsing light. The discharge had begun, but it wasn't an explosion. It was a controlled release. The violet light flowed down the spire, through the copper-laced walls, and into the well in the forest, grounding the mountain's fury. The calm didn't last. While the house managed the energy, the human threat became more desperate. Dr. Aries, the modern scientist, had realized she didn't need the house if she could tap into the well directly. Paul watched from the rooftop as her team moved a heavy, truck-mounted drill toward the Three Sisters. They're going to break the seal. Paul gasped. He scrambled back down through the skylight, racing through the house to the kitchen. He grabbed the old walking stick and the silver key. He needed to reach the forest before they pierced the vault's ceiling. If they released the pressure too quickly, the grounding would fail, and the earthquake would be catastrophic. He burst out the back door. The forest felt different, ancient and watchful. The trees seemed to lean toward the path, their leaves whispering in a language he could almost understand. He reached the clearing just as the drill bit touched the mossy stone. "Stop!" Paul shouted. Dr. Aries turned, her face illuminated by the violet glow of the well. She looked obsessed. "You don't understand, Paul. This is clean energy for 1,000 years. My great-grandfather was a fool to hide it. We can power the world with the stars. It's not a battery, Aries." Paul countered, stepping between her and the machine. "It's a balance. If you take this, you don't just power the world, you shift the Earth's axis. Look at the readings." He pointed to her own tablet, which was flickering with warning signs. The resonance was becoming unstable because of her drill's interference. The ground began to groan, a sound like 1,000 giant cellos playing a single, dissonant chord. This was the singing mountain Dr. Aries had written about in the ledger. The vibrations were so strong that the drill rig began to sink into the softening earth. "The mineral is reacting." Paul yelled over the noise. The violet light from the well intensified, turning into a pillar of pure energy that reached toward the clouds. The Geocore team panicked, abandoning their equipment and running toward the SUVs. Only Dr. Aries stayed, her hand reaching for the glowing pillar as if mesmerized. Paul realized that the mercury of the stars on the house's antenna was drawing the energy, but the drill had created a leak. He had to use the silver key to manually override the vault's pressure release. He dove into the freezing water of the stream, searching for the submerged keyhole once more. The water was boiling with kinetic energy. Paul felt the silver key vibrate in his hand. He found the lock and turned it. With a massive thump, the secondary safety valves opened. The energy was redirected back into the house's grid, away from the drill site. The pillar of light shifted, bending like a willow branch toward the stone house on the hill. The mountain's song changed. The dissonance vanished, replaced by a pure, steady hum. The tectonic pressure stabilized. Paul pulled himself out of the water, gasping for air. Dr. Aries was gone. Whether she had fled or been swept away, he didn't know. The clearing was empty, save for the abandoned, ruined machinery of the corporation. In the silence that followed, a figure emerged from the shadows of the three sisters. It was Mrs. Miller, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man Paul hadn't seen in years. His own father. "Dad," Paul whispered, his voice trembling. "You did well, Paul," his father said, stepping into the fading violet light. "Henry knew you were the only one who could handle the transition. The lineage of the Sentinel isn't just about blood, it's about the ability to hear the mountain." Paul's father explained that he had been working from the city, keeping the corporate lawyers away from the estate as long as possible. The bank robbery of 1994 had been a cover to protect the Aries ledger from a previous corporate takeover. Henry had taken the fall and the isolation to keep the secret safe. "The Society of the Silver Star isn't a myth," his father said, handing Paul a small, leather-bound compass. "It's a network of families who have guarded these nodes for centuries. We aren't scientists or kings. We are the anchors." Paul looked at the stone house. It was glowing softly, a beacon of silver light in the dark valley. He finally understood his uncle's life. It wasn't a life of loneliness, but one of immense, quiet purpose. He wasn't a prisoner of the house. He was the heartbeat of the valley. The year 2026 was not yet over. The Great Alignment, where the 5 inner planets formed a perfect line with the North Star, was still 3 days away. Paul, Robert, and his father spent the time preparing the house for the zenith discharge. They used the workshop to calibrate the orreries, ensuring the house's copper mesh was perfectly tuned to the incoming cosmic frequency. Paul learned the complex mathematics of the stars, realizing that the starfall mineral was actually a form of condensed dark matter that had fallen to Earth eons ago. The calculations were precise. If the alignment was off by even a fraction of a degree, the energy would bypass the grounding rod and shatter the bedrock. Paul worked until his fingers were stained with ink and copper dust. He felt a strange sense of peace. He was no longer a confused nephew. He was the master of the stone house. "Tonight is the night," Robert said, looking at the clear sky. "The stars are in position. The mountain is quiet. It's waiting for you, Paul." At midnight, the sky over Oakwood turned a deep, iridescent purple. The stars didn't twinkle. They burned with a steady, fierce light. Paul stood in the attic, his hand on the quartz telescope. His father and Robert stood in the basement, monitoring the grounding rungs. The alignment began. A beam of white light, thin as a needle, descended from the North Star and struck the copper spire. The stone house didn't just hum, it sang. A pure, crystalline note echoed through the valley. The energy flowed through the walls, through the mercury-fused cables, and into the earth. Paul watched through the attic's eye as the cosmic energy washed over the starfall mineral, recharging it for the next century. Where is the celestial flux? Paul felt the pulse move through his body, a surge of warmth and clarity. He saw the history of the earth, the birth of the mountains, and the ancient travelers who had first marked this spot. The discharge lasted for exactly 7 minutes. Then, with a soft, fading chime, the light vanished. The alignment was over. The morning after the zenith was the quietest Paul had ever experienced. There was no hum, no vibration, no metallic scent in the air. The stone house felt like a regular house again. Dusty, old, and full of memories. GeoCore Solutions had officially withdrawn their survey. The thermal anomaly had vanished from their satellites, and their equipment had been mysteriously rendered useless by the discharge. Dr. Aries had resigned, her reputation ruined by her reckless attempt to drill into a protected seismic zone. Paul walked through the village. The people of Oakwood nodded to him with a new kind of respect. They didn't know the details of dark matter or celestial flux, but they knew the mountain was safe. They knew the boy from the stone house had done his duty. He returned to the house and sat in the kitchen. The old clock on the wall, silent for 30 years, suddenly began to tick. The house was back in sync with time. It is now late 2026. Paul sits on the porch of the stone house, watching the sunset. He is 30 years old, but he feels the wisdom of the stones in his bones. He has turned the secret gallery into a small, private library for the village children, teaching them about the stars and the importance of the earth. The Aries ledger is back in its secret compartment, but Paul doesn't need to read it anymore. He knows the rhythms of the mountain by heart. He knows when the rain will come and when the stars will shift. Robert still visits for tea, and Mrs. Miller still brings her laundry, but there is an unspoken understanding between them. The Society of the Silver Star lives on, not in secret meetings or dark robes, but in the simple act of caring for a home. Paul looks up at the sky. The North Star is bright and steady. He knows that 100 years from now, another Sentinel will sit on this porch. They will find the silver key, they will hear the hum in the walls, and they will keep the watch. The stars are always watching. Paul whispers, a small, knowing smile on his face. And so am I. The stone house stands tall on the hill, a silent guardian of the valley, its windows glowing with a warmth that is both ancient and new. The secret is safe. The Sentinel is home.